Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to finally bring you my November wrap-up. November, as you should know, is Native Heritage Month, and therefore it was also Indigathon, and we did a round of Tome Topple, and it was also Nonfiction November, so I'm going to take you through what I read for each of those events. First up is a book I started at the end of October and then finished within the first day or so of November, and that was an arc of In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. If you were not aware, Carmen Maria Machado is a queer Latinx writer, author of Her Body and Other Parties. This is her memoir, and it's a collection of essays recounting a deeply abusive relationship with one of her exes. Definite trigger warnings for everything you can think of relating to abuse of all kinds. This is one of those books where I know for a fact that I am not smart enough to discuss it in the way it deserves, but I'm gonna do my best. This memoir is a triumph of style and voice because it's dark and surreal and inventive, and it's told through a series of chapters that cycle through different kinds of narrative voice. So one chapter might be Dream House as world building, or Dream House as idiom, or Dream House as I Love Lucy, or Dream House as Chekhov's gun, or Dream House as choose your own adventure, and depending on the style, the way that scene is shown changes. And one of the absolute hardest parts of abuse is recognizing it and naming it as such, and feeling like what you've been through is enough to warrant the name of abuse. And this memoir really shows how difficult it is to do that for yourself, which is something I recognize from my own experience with abuse. This memoir also breaks down how our society fails to address abuse in queer relationships, not only socially, but legally and academically, and it's largely because people want to believe that queer folks are good and perfect in order to justify us having rights. And ultimately that just forces queer survivors of abuse into a different kind of closet. I think that's really what the dream house represents, being welcomed into the dream of being loved and safe and accepted, only to end up as a phantom haunting your own life, your own story, your own space. This memoir is deeply ambitious, and Machado just flays herself open within the pages in a way that's so impossibly close, and I think that definitely pays off, which is why I gave this a huge 5 stars. Then Brody and I buddy read Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead, and I listened to the audiobook read by the author himself. This is an Own Voices realistic fiction story about Johnny Appleseed, who belongs to the Peguis First Nation, and he is a queer two-spirit cybersex worker who willingly fetishizes himself to make ends meet. Johnny is trying to get back to the res to attend a funeral, and the story is basically a rumination on what it means to return home, while Johnny is also trying to make sense of the pieces of his life. Trigger warnings for mentions of homophobic slurs, instances of homophobia, and depictions of abuse. I love this book. It wonderfully explores modern sensibilities of Indigenous experiences and presents this vibrant character who is incredibly aware that people have all these wild, antiquated ideas about what it means to be Native, and who uses those misconceptions to create a living and a profit for himself. Johnny's identity as a two-spirit person is also something that is supposed to be deeply respected in his community, and by nature it's about inhabiting multiple roles, yet as a child he was often ushered into distinctly male roles because that was easier for everyone else. Because of that, there's a lot of pain and trauma associated with his childhood and his experiences on the reservation, which is what drove him away in the first place. So I think it's powerful that Johnny takes up cybersex work as a way to initially deflect his past and his upbringing as someone who was deeply repressed, but then in the end, it's what literally ushers him home and reminds him of who he really is. This is a beautiful, complicated story that blends past and present to create a narrative that is unmistakably alive, and even though the middle got a little bit murky, I really loved it and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I finally listened to Sabrina and Karina, stories by Kelly Fallardo-Anstein, read by Almari Guerra, Roxana Ortega, Alma Cuervo, Ana Isabel, Kayla Garcia, and Marisol Ramirez. I don't know for sure whether or not this collection is Own Voices, but it's a short story collection about Indigenous Latinx women living in Denver, Colorado, and it chronicles the struggles these characters face in simply trying to exist. I think this is definitely an amazing collection of stories. Each piece felt full and complete while also building up the reader to the edge of an emotional cliff and then simply walking away at the last possible moment. The author does a great job of creating this lasting haunting effect that lingers throughout the collection, as well as crafting these characters who feel very immediate and close. To me, these stories are connected by themes of grief and loss of family, loss of culture, loss of self, but also a determination to stand apart from your circumstances in a world that will fundamentally not allow that to happen. It's always hard for me to review short story collections because each piece is different and worthy of its own discussion, but I found each of these stories to be vivid and poignant, which is why I gave it 4.5 stars. Then for Tome Topple, I used my library to read and listen to The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, read by Leah Summers. I read this and I still don't know how to describe it. It's basically a high fantasy story with a prominent FF relationship where the East and West fundamentally disagree about the existence of dragons and their purpose. These beliefs all begin with an ancient evil known as the Nameless One, and his defeat is shrouded in mystery and mythology with different origin stories depending on the region, but basically everyone believes that the royal line of Berethnet is the key to his continued imprisonment. Which brings us to the current heir and queen, Sabran, who is trying to produce a daughter, which is where everything sort of starts. Trigger warnings for graphic violence, descriptions of miscarriage, peripheral degenerative illness, and brief mentions of incest. This book is convoluted, no doubt, and highly ambitious, and generally speaking, I think it succeeds for what it is. It sets out to tell a complete, self-contained epic all in one go, and that's exactly what it does. As a reader, I'm always looking for a point of entry, for a way I can access and begin to parse a story, and I think my main takeaway is that this story is an exploration of women who are struggling to feel that they are enough. You have Sabran, who everyone thinks is only as good as what her uterus can produce. You have Ayad, who's struggling to fulfill her mission and understand her place. You have Tane, who has dedicated her life to becoming a dragon rider only to doubt herself in the end. And this story shows all of these characters becoming more than those things. And it's a story that shows there's room in fantasy for so many things to exist, whether it's complex female characters or conversations about depression and mental health or queer relationships. All of those things are given room to exist. My main issues were that the underlying quest got a little bit convoluted and that the big bad in this story was a little too simplistic for my taste. And those critiques may seem at odds, but that's just how I felt. I don't care for evil forces that exist simply for the sake of being evil and then by definition are evil just because they exist. However, I found the character dynamics to be exciting and engaging, and I was definitely invested in the story every single time I came back to it, so for those reasons I gave it 4 stars. Then also for Tome Topple, I read the first part of The Way of Thorn and Thunder, previously known as Kinship by Daniel Heath Justice. The author is Two-Spirit, queer, and part of the Cherokee Nation, and this is his own voice's high fantasy story about a world called the Everland, which is protected and preserved by those who have weird powers, but now those powers are under siege. Our main character, Tarsadashe, is a newly awakened Weir warrior who is journeying to the capital as her people ready themselves to contend with the race of men, and as a wielder, she is trying to understand her place in this conflict. I'm gonna be honest, this story was pretty dense and took a lot of focus to get through, which is saying something because I didn't even get through the entire book. I do think it's an exciting story in that it reframes the typical hero's quest and repurposes it through a native lens. I also had so much empathy for Tarsadashe, who's just trying to understand her power and how it works. I like that she's being guided by her family and by elders who are trying to show her how to connect to her culture and her past, and how that connection manifests into a literal power that can destroy evil forces. The story also includes a third gender with alternative gender pronouns, which is awesome, and it also openly and frankly explores the race of men trying to convince these nations to leave behind their land and convert to the new ways, which is a very real conflict. So the story also shows Tarsa and her people coming to terms with the fact that the world is changing and the way they understand the world is changing, but that they are not going anywhere and they have to stay true to themselves. But like I said, it is a very traditional fantasy story in the sense that it moves at a slower pace and comes packaged in a way that is very dense, but I did enjoy what I read from it, and if I had to rate it so far, I would say it's about 3.5 stars. After that, I read Volume 1 of Moonshot, the Indigenous Comic Collection, edited by Hope Nicholson. This is an Own Voices comic anthology that brings together a ton of Indigenous authors and artists to showcase Indigenous histories, mythologies, creation myths, and futurisms of all kinds. I think the sheer amount of variety presented in this anthology is what I appreciate the most. There's stories about superheroes and comics about the making and unmaking of the world, stories told only in images, comics told only in words, poetry pieces, and comics that echo traditional storytelling methods. There are pieces of memoir and fantasy and fabulism standing side by side in one book. This collection succeeds in showing that no two native experiences are the same, no two ideologies are the same, no two nations are the same, and most importantly, that Indigenous futurism occupies a really exciting space. This comic anthology, I felt, was really about connecting the past, present, and future of Native nations, and it's also a great way to discover tons of incredible Native authors and illustrators, so for that I gave this one 4.5 stars. Then on Brody's recommendation, I listened to Crota by Owl Going Back, read by Heath Kizier. This is another Own Voices indigenous paranormal creature feature about this ancient harbinger of darkness known as the Crota, who's been unleashed on this small town in Missouri, and the local police force there is helpless to make sense of the strange spike in killings and disappearances. There's a citizen named Jay Littlehawk, who I believe belongs to the Lakota people of the Great Sioux Nation, and who immediately recognizes the mark of the Crota and goes to get help from others in his nation before attempting to aid the police. Definite trigger warnings for descriptive gore and violence, descriptions of mutilation and dismemberment, death of animals and pets, and references to outdated racial epithets. I read this book in just 2 days because the suspense was that gripping and because it moves at a brutal breakneck pace. It is sort of methodic in that it shows an attack scene and then bits of investigation and then another attack scene and more investigation, almost like clockwork, but I think that formula works for this book. But what I really enjoyed was the framing of who gets to be the hero in this narrative. Usually it's the lone inspector, typically a white man who goes against the grain and cracks the case, and while the story does have one of those, he realizes he is way out of his depth on this one and that he doesn't have the power, the authority, or the knowledge to close this case. Ultimately, he has to turn to Littlehawk and he has to open his heart to the traditional ways and accept things he did not previously understand in order to triumph. And it's Littlehawk in his fundamental understanding of the past who has the authority and the power to conquer the Crota, which is really powerful to think about. I do want to mention that this book was first published in the 90s and it does suffer from an all-male focus and gaze that trivializes any non-masculine characters, and it does resort to gratuitous graphic descriptions as a shorthand for fear and discomfort and grittiness, all of which I could definitely do without, but I still enjoyed the story for what it was and I gave it 4 stars. And finally, I did a buddy read with Njeri of Onyx Pages, and together we have been discussing The Dark Fantastic by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. This is more of an academic nonfiction collection of essays that explores children's fiction and popular fiction in relation to its severe diversity crisis. In these essays, Thomas argues that it's not simply a lack of representation, but a lack of imagination, and how the popular stories we circulate the most play a key role in formulating that imagination and the ideas that permeate our collective consciousness. And she posits that the only way to become emancipated from this lack of imagination is to restory and counterstory popular narratives and transform these dark others into characters who are powerful, agentive, and complex. These essays were a powerful affirmation of things I already knew and felt, and it was liberating to see someone articulate the fact that what we center, who we center, and how we center it has a deeply profound ripple effect. As Njeri says in her own video, which I will link down below and you should definitely watch, this book is really fantastic for giving marginalized audiences the language to understand and describe their absence in media and its impact. There was a great metaphor where Thomas talks about how the spotlight inherently casts everything else around it in shadows, and by focusing our attention on certain characters, we are still developing an understanding of what's not in the spotlight just for its absence. If we buy into these popular narratives like Harry Potter, Hunger Games, Vampire Diaries, and internalize the highest standards of beauty, goodness, intellect, and complexity as being white and cis and straight and able-bodied, then the inverse also becomes true for every one of those opposites. We have to reclaim and repurpose story and the fantastic itself if we hope to perpetuate different ideas, and I think that's ultimately Thomas's point. Again, I am definitely not smart enough to fully discuss this text, and each of these essays could warrant its own discussion, but this was great and I gave it 5 stars. So at long last, those are all the books I read in the month of November. As always, if you've read any of them yourself, feel free to hit me up in the comments so we can discuss, or let me know what's something that you're excited to read in the final weeks of 2019. But that's everything I have for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye.